One of the things, I wanted to take a couple of weeks here because in 2 weeks from today, I'm going to be starting another series. We're going to be looking at the Gospel of John. And we're going to be in the Gospel of John for quite a while, just because there's so much there, so much meat there. But I wanted to take 2 weeks before we get into that, and I want to talk about a concept, a biblical, I'm going to say mandate, a biblical concept that God has laid out and that He has given to us, and that is the concept of blessing. Blessing. This is something that is very foreign to us, foreign to our culture. Now, some people coming from different cultures may have a bit more of a tradition in this. But I'm going to unpack a bit of what a biblical blessing is and why we desperately need it. This is something that even if you don't realize it, we all long for this. We all long for this. And so we're going to be looking at that this morning. We're going to be focusing on the story of Jacob and Esau, found in Genesis 27. I'm introducing this now, just in concept. We'll talk about it for the next 2 weeks, this week and next. And then in the springtime, we're going to be looking at this more so, and I'm actually going to be doing a blessing ceremony. Okay, this is going to be something where parents, families, and there'll be a lot of kind of training for this and getting familiar with this idea. But it'll be an opportunity for parents and for people to come together and to bless the younger generation, to bless children, and we're going to pull from a lot of these ideas, but I kind of wanted to introduce it now so you can be thinking about this. And the reality is, whether you're at the place where you have children, if you have young children, or even, this would have been something that in Jewish tradition, they would do this at various points. One specifically would have been whenever a child was bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, so like kind of the 12, 13 range, somewhere in there. But there's all kinds of opportunity for giving blessing. But this is something that even if we're past that, even if our kids are kind of grown up and we're older, the reality is this is something that we long for, and this is something that we long to be able to give as well. So keep that in mind, that this is going to be something that we revisit, but we're just going to kind of talk about what it is, what a biblical blessing is. And even in this story of Jacob and Esau, that seems, deeply dysfunctional as it is. And we're going to talk about that. But regardless, this is a beautiful picture and a beautiful thing that God has established and has given to us that we really don't use. Our culture just doesn't take advantage of this. I think primarily because we just don't know how. We don't know what this really means. If you were to ask someone now, like a young person, it's like, at what point do you become an adult? A lot of people would say, you can get your license. Is it still 16? Okay, you get your license, get some freedom there. You can start working a job. You can, at 18, you're legally responsible and you get to do all these kinds of, other things that you didn't get to do. But at what point do you see yourself now as no longer a child? Now you're an adult, right? This transition period. Now, like in our culture, we have this concept of adolescence, which begins, early teens, and who knows when it ends, right? I don't know. In biblical understanding and in biblical culture, there was no such period as adolescence. It was clearly you are either a child or now you're an adult. Right? Now you are. That's what bar mitzvah and bat mitzvah mean, is son and daughter of the commands. Like now you are fully accountable for your choices. Okay, so there's a clear distinction there between, in growing up and these different sort of phases of life and so forth. But we're gonna talk more about that and just the importance of that and how all of us even can draw from that, and all of us can participate in this as well. So, for a little bit of brief context, this story comes in Genesis 27. God is focusing in on a certain family, and that's because in Genesis 12, God had made a promise to Abraham and to his descendants. He was launching, what he was doing was he was launching his rescue plan for humanity, but he chose to do it through a family. And so with that, Abraham was blessed by God, and then there are promises associated with that. And one of the things that came out of that down the line was in each generation there would be a leader or a head of the clan, a head of the family, and there was a lot of responsibilities associated with that. One of them was even you could use the phrase like a priestly type responsibility, that they were responsible for the spiritual well-being of their family and their household and so forth. And that was passed on down from one generation to the next. And we know from Abraham, Abraham had 2 sons, but only one according to the promise. Right? Isaac was the son of promise. So God made it clear that it's going to be through him that this promise and this seed is going to continue. And on down. And then when Isaac has his 2 sons here, and we're going to pick this story up of Jacob and Esau. And a little bit of backstory on this. We know beforehand that there was always kind of this friction between Jacob and Esau. And part of that maybe was because of their upbringing. We find early on in that story, it says that Isaac loved Esau and Rebekah loved Jacob. And if you get a little bit of an inkling that you're kind of setting up for a little bit of dysfunction there, a little bit of problems down the line, and you'd be right, because it shows, however real that was, it showed definitely some favoritism. But we find out that God actually made a promise to Isaac's wife Rebekah that the younger was going to be served by the older, so that there was going to be a switch. Now, typically it was the older, the firstborn son was the one that was, that had all these rights and duties and responsibilities and so forth. Anthropologists call this the law of primogeniture. It was just this, the focus on the eldest son who got the lion's share of the inheritance and these other responsibilities. But there's plenty of places in Scripture where God kind of changes that. And of course we know that Jacob and Esau were twins. And as the story goes, Jacob was born second, but he was like reaching or grasping at the heel of Esau when he was born. So it was pretty close. Now I can tell you this from having twins, they know exactly who's older. Right? Adelise is older by 3 minutes, and she will tell you she is the middle daughter because of those 3 minutes, right? And Eliana is the youngest by 3 minutes. And so even though it was very close, there's still technically, a firstborn and a next with Jacob and Esau. Now we're going to focus primarily on Jacob for this. We'll talk a little bit about Esau, but primarily we're going to look at Jacob here. Jacob is like the most unheroic hero in the Bible. I mean, he's got some issues. He's got problems all along the way, a lot of which he kind of brings on himself. But we're going to see how this plays out in this story and in this family. So we're going to pick this up. In chapter 27, we find that Isaac is advanced in years. He's getting pretty old, and he knows that his time is short. And even we discover that he is blind or nearly blind. And so he calls his oldest son Esau, and he's going to bless him. Like, the time is coming where I'm going to give you my blessing, and that is going to be, that was something for them that was deeply sought after. Now, before this, we know the story where Jacob tricks Esau into selling him his birthright. Now, those two things are related. They're not exactly the same. Apparently, Esau didn't really care about that. He didn't really care about the birthright so much, because if you remember that part of the story, he was willing to give it up for a bowl of lentils, right? Because he was starving to death, as he said, when he came back from the field. And Jacob kind of used that to, Jacob was manipulative, he was a deceiver, a supplanter, that's what he did. And so he used that opportunity to say, sell me your birthright. And Esau, we find later in the book of Hebrews, it says that he despised his birthright after he kind of gave that away. But the blessing was a little different, because both of them desperately desired to have the blessing of their father. And so we pick up the story when Rebekah, Isaac's wife, overhears Isaac asking Esau to go out into the field and hunt and to get some wild game and then prepare it, because Esau was a man's man. He was a hunter. He was good at preparing dishes and wild meat and so forth, and Isaac loved that about him. Maybe it was like he saw himself in Esau a bit. There was something there that he really, he had a deep love for Esau. And so he sent him out, and Rebekah, overhearing this, goes and devises this plan. And she goes to Jacob and says, okay, here's what you're going to do. You're going to put on Esau's clothes. I'm going to cover your arms. Well, there was some interaction there, but they decided they're going to cover his arms with hair, with animal skins, because Jacob was like, well, but if he touches me, then I don't have any like arm hair or anything. I'm kind of smooth, right? But Esau apparently was pretty hairy. And so covered him. We're going to take care of that issue. And along with his garment, along with the clothes, would have been the smell. Smell like Esau, right? Like smell like, as we see later, it smells like a field that the Lord has blessed, is what Isaac says. But they come up with this plan. She cooks a meal, so she kills probably some domesticated sheep or goat or something, prepares the meat, and then sends him in with it. And he has an objection to this. He says, but what if he finds out it's me and he curses me? Instead of a blessing, I get a curse. Rebekah's response to this is kind of chilling. She said, let that curse fall on me. Let that curse fall on me. And interestingly, throughout this whole thing, they're not just saying things like, well, the blessing is just words anyway, or a curse is just words. They understood that these words matter and that these words meant something. For us today, how does the nursery rhyme go? Sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. You believe that? If you've ever overheard something, or maybe even directly heard something from someone you care about that wasn't so flattering or kind for you, you know that that's a bunch of garbage. The more appropriate way to say that would probably be, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can crush my soul. The reality is, we were created in the image of a God who brought everything into being. How? By speaking. It was by God's speaking that he brought everything about, everything into being. Words matter, which is probably why several places in Scripture give us a pretty strong mandate to bridle our tongue, to keep control of your tongue. What does it say in Proverbs, I believe? It gives a warning that death and life are in the power of the tongue. And it even talks about gossip. Gossip kills three: the one who speaks, the one who listens, and the one who is spoken of. These aren't just trivial things. These aren't just things that don't matter. Words matter. And you see this a bit more so when we find, and this is very strange to me, and this is what kind of prompted me to really dig into this. The idea that a blessing, a verbal affirmation, a verbal declaration could be stolen. Think about that. They're coming up with this plan that Jacob's going to go in and he's going to receive a blessing from his father, which was completely deceptive, right? He's going to get something that didn't belong to him. And Isaac was going to give it to him. He was going to give him this blessing. And then that was it. It was his. Now, in this story, apparently that's something that can be stolen. How can you steal that? Wouldn't Isaac just say, whenever he realized his mistake, right? You know, a few moments later when Esau comes back and he realizes, like, oh, I messed up, I blessed the wrong person. We're going to look at that, but what happens is it was stolen, and it was indeed stolen. It was gone. It couldn't be given again. It couldn't be given again. So they saw words as whenever they're spoken, they almost take on a life and a persona all their own. That there is something about that comes to life. There's something that is about the spoken word that is crucial, especially in a context of a blessing from in this instance, from a father to a son. How is it that could be stolen? Now, apparently as well, it cannot be undone. Even if he did it unknowingly, even if he blessed the wrong person. And we're going to look at what that looks like. But that is something that kind of bothered me, because I thought, if he realized he made a mistake, well, then we just need to make an amendment to this, retract that. It's supposed to go to you instead of you, and all is well. No, it was done. It was done. Now, that we're going to see that blessing lay dormant for Jacob for some time, but we'll look at how that develops in the story. It's pretty incredible. But look at this in Genesis 27 and chapter 27, verse 28. It says, "Now may God give you of the dew of heaven, and the fatness of the earth, and an abundance of grain and new wine." Now, whenever Esau comes back and he realizes that this has all happened already, that it's been done, that the blessing's been given, Isaac responds to him by saying this in verse 37. He said, "But Isaac replied to Esau, 'Behold, I have made him your master.'" Okay, this has already happened. "And all his relatives I have given to him as servants. And with grain and new wine I have sustained him. Now as for you then, what can I do, my son?" Do you see that Isaac is affirming what he did? He's saying, this is already done. I've already given him the grain and the wine and everything else. So I don't have that to give to you anymore. He already gave that away. That's interesting. And we find that upon hearing this, Esau is crushed. He is crushed because he knows he will never get what was given, was supposed to be given to him, to the oldest son, but was given to Jacob instead. He knows that he will never get that. Now, does Isaac then bless Esau? He does. It's not very flattering at all. It almost rings more like a curse. It's kind of like, yeah, you're going to be the servant of your brother. And it's already been given. It's already been given away. Now, let's talk a bit about what a blessing entails. And this is from, we can derive this much from this story and then from a bit from culture and history, where they would put a hand usually on the shoulder or on the head of the child, and there were words that were spoken, not just any words, and not just a general kind of blessing. It was more of a special word for that child specifically. So in order to bless, like if you're going to bless your child, there would have been something that is specifically designed for them. Later on, if you were to kind of study this, if you look at Jacob later in, I think it's in chapter 48 of Genesis, where he blesses all of his sons. And you see it's not all the same. It's not just this blanket I wish you well. And it's also not just a final will and testament. There's a little bit of that in it, that your brothers, that you will have sort of control of the clan and of the family, but there's a bit more to it than that. It's a special picture of a future for that child specifically. And in order to do that, you have to know your child individually pretty well. You're going to speak words of life into them, words of hope, and even encouragement in the path that they are to go. Right, we're told in Proverbs that, we're told, train up a child in the way they should go, and when they are old, they will not depart from it. Now, that is a principle, not a promise. So make note of that. I've heard people bring that to me and say, well, I train them the way they should go, so, they should, right? And it's like, well, it's generally a principle. Train them in the way they should go. And not teach, train. Train them in the way they should go. But it's possessive, the way that they should go. They have a path, right? That's going to be, if you have several children, their paths are going to be different. They don't have the same path, and they're not supposed to have the same path. You're blessing them in the path that they ought to go. He also, in this blessing, he uses word pictures. This is something that was very common. The smell is like the smell of a field that the Lord has blessed, right? There's these images associated with it. There's this special future, this special hope, and it's a picture of acceptance and love. It's a picture of acceptance and love. If you've ever been blessed, then you know what this is about. You know what this means. If you haven't, then it might not be verbalized, but this is something that we all deeply desire. I'm going to read, this is from actually a book by two Christian, I think they're psychologists or counselors, Gary Smalley and John Trent. And this book actually speaks specifically to this idea. It's called The Gift of the Blessing. And it unpacks this biblical idea. But I want to read two examples to you. And this is going to make a little bit more, it's going to come home a little bit more for us, I think. There's two instances of what it looks like when people don't get that blessing, don't get what they're looking for. Please say that you love and accept me. Brian's words trailed off into tears as he leaned over the now still form of his father. It was late at night in a large metropolitan hospital. Only the cold white walls and the humming of a heart monitor kept Brian company. His tears revealed a deep inner pain and sensitivity that had tormented him for years. Emotional wounds now seemed beyond repair. Brian had flown nearly halfway across the country to be at his father's side at one last attempt to try to reconcile years of misunderstanding and resentment. All his life, Brian had been searching for his father's acceptance and approval, but they always seemed just out of reach. Brian's father had been a career Marine officer. His sole desire for Brian was that when he grew up, he would follow in his father's footsteps. With that in mind, Brian's father took every opportunity to instill in his son discipline and the backbone he would need to one day be an officer. Words of love or tenderness were forbidden in their home. It was almost as if any slip into a display of warmth might crack the tough exterior Brian's father was trying to create in his son. Brian's father drove him to participate in sports, take elective classes that would best equip him to be an officer. Brian's only praise for scoring a touchdown or doing well in a class was a lecture on how he could have and should have done it better. After graduating from high school, Brian did enlist in the Marine Corps. It was the happiest day of his father's life. However, his joy was short-lived. Cited for attitude problems and disrespect for orders, his son was soon on report, and after weeks of such report, which included getting into a fight with his drill instructor, Brian was dishonorably discharged from service of the military. The news of Brian's dismissal from the Marine Corps dealt a death blow to his relationship with his father. He was no longer welcome in his father's house, and for years there was no contact between them. During those years, Brian struggled with feelings of inferiority and lacked confidence. Even though he was above average in intelligence, he worked at various jobs far below his ability. 3 times he had been engaged, only to break off the engagement weeks before the wedding. Somehow he just didn't believe that another person could actually love him. Although Brian was unaware of it at the time, he was experiencing common symptoms of growing up without a sense of family blessing, a missing element in his life that finally led him to seek professional help. We began counseling with Brian after he had broken his 3rd engagement. As he peeled away the layers of his past, Brian began to see both his need for his family's blessing and his responsibility for dealing honestly with his parents. That is, when the call came from his mother saying that his father was dying of a heart attack, Brian immediately went to the hospital to see his father. The entire flight was filled with hope that now, at long last, he could talk and reconcile their relationship. I'm sure he'll listen to me now. I've learned so much. I know things are going to change between us. Brian repeated to himself these phrases along the flight, but it was not so. Brian's father slipped into a coma a few hours before he arrived. The words of Brian that Brian longed to hear for the first time, words of love and acceptance, now would never be spoken. 4 hours after Brian arrived at the hospital, his father died without regaining consciousness. "Dad, please wake up." Brian's heartbreaking sobs echoed down the hospital corridor. His cries spoke of an incredible sense of loss, not only the physical loss of a father, but like many others, an emotional sense of losing any chance of a father's blessing. I'm going to read a bit from one more, kind of on the other side with mother and daughter and what this can look like. Nancy's loss was a different sort, but the hurt and pain she received from missing out on the blessing stung her just as deeply. In fact, living apart from the blessing had caused problems not only with her parents, but with her husband and children as well. Nancy grew up in an affluent suburb outside of a major city. During her early years, her mother loved to socialize with other women at the club and frequent civic activities. In fact, with a marriage that was less than fulfilling, these social gatherings became of paramount importance to Nancy's mother. When Nancy was very young, her mother would dress her up in all kinds of elegant clothes, the kind that you had to sit still in, that you couldn't play in, and take her and her older sister to the club. But as Nancy grew older, this practice began to change. Unlike her mother and older sister, Nancy was not petite. In fact, she was quite large and big boned. Nor was Nancy a model of tranquility. She was a tomboy. She loved outdoor games, swinging on fences, and animals of all kinds. You might imagine such behavior from a daughter who was being groomed to be a debutante caused real problems. Nancy's mother tried desperately to mend her daughter's erring ways. Nancy would constantly scold her by calling her awkward and clumsy. During shopping sprees, Nancy was often subject to verbal barbs designed to motivate her to lose weight. "All the really nice clothes are 2 sizes too small for you. They're your sister's size." Her mother would taunt. Nancy was finally forced on a strict diet to make her physically presentable to others. Nancy tried hard to stick to her diet and be all her mother wanted. However, more and more, Nancy's mother and sister would go to social events and leave her at home. Soon all invitations to join these functions stopped. After all, her mother told her, "You don't want to be embarrassed because of the way you look with all the other children around, do you?" When Nancy first came in for counseling, she was in her 30s, married, mother of 2 children. For years, she had struggled with weight and with feelings of inferiority. Her marriage had been a constant struggle as well. You can see how these things play out. And even side comments, things that are said, maybe just in jest, but that actually deeply matter. And especially for someone who is longing for something real, something of substance, and something hopeful and affirming from a parent can mean so much. And it can go the other way. And this longing that we have for this kind of affirmation, there's a couple of problems that come associated with this. The first one is that, you could take away the lesson from this, one, as being, what should we do with this? Be good parents. That's a simple one. Okay, what if I'm older? What if I'm past that stage? Or what if I grew up in a family or in a situation that wasn't very loving and wasn't very, didn't have any good positive affirmation for me growing up? What if I'm 30-something and already screwed up? Then what? The good news is, and we're gonna see this in this instance with Jacob and Esau. The reality is we are all in a broken state, and even though some of us may come from a much better family, none of us come from a perfect family. And one of the things that was something that was difficult in growing up, that you realize, now children realize this, they all realize it at some point in their life. Sometimes earlier, sometimes later on. But at some point you come to the realization that your parents are far from perfect. And that can be really hard. That can be really hard to see and to experience. Because when you're younger, your parents they can do everything, right? Everything's great, and they are good at everything, and they do everything they should. And again, coming from a better family helps. But the reality is, there is a realization of that failing at some point. There's a realization there, and you have to come to terms with that. And in this instance, what we're talking about and what we're dealing with is a spiritual issue. It's a spiritual issue. There was a great deal of dysfunction in this relationship with Jacob and Esau and his family. And we're going to see something here. The good news is God is in the business of working with broken people and broken families. Broken individuals and broken families. And to be honest, I forget who said this. Someone more famous. We put a lot of stock these days in society and in what society is doing and how to change society. I forget who said this, but they said, there's no such thing as society. There's only individuals and families. There might be something to that. What is society? It's a collection of individuals, a collection of families. Right? This is the unit, right? And make no mistake, there's a reason why the family is under such attack. There's a reason for that. Because if you come from a pretty solid family, then there's not a whole lot that can shake you. But again, the reality is, you come to a realization that your family's not perfect. And in this story, there's something incredible that takes place. And this is where, there's really, there's no specific mention of God intervening in this, except we see something here in verse 33 that's kind of incredible. Actually, let's pick it up in 32. This is when Esau comes back in seeking this blessing, and he's anticipating it, he's longing for it, and he's asking for it. And Isaac his father, verse 32, said unto him, Who are you? And he said, I am thy son, thy firstborn Esau. And Isaac trembled very exceedingly, and he said, Who? Where is he that has taken venison and brought it to me? And I have eaten all before you came, and I have blessed him, yes, and he will be blessed. This is the moment when Isaac realizes something. He realizes that the one he thought he was blessing was not the one he was actually blessing. But instead of trying to take it back, I think Isaac also realized what it looked like for God to intervene. What it looked like for God to come in at the last minute and make a change. What it looked like for God to come in at the last minute and make a substitution. Is there anything in Isaac's life that might have given him a heads up on what that might look like? Where God came in at the last moment and made a change? How about a long time ago when Abraham, his father, was about to sacrifice him on an altar? And God said, hold on, we're going to make a switch here. And he brought in, we know the story, there was a ram that was caught in the thicket. And right at the very last, God made a switch so that the one who was going to be executed was spared, and the one that was there, the ram, was killed in his place. I think Isaac realized something at this moment. Because it says that he trembled very exceedingly. He wasn't just mad. He didn't come out and say, oh, that foolish Jacob, I'll get him. That was for Esau to say later, actually. But he doesn't say that. He trembles exceedingly, and he reaffirms the blessing that he gave to Jacob. He didn't try to undo it. He just said, I have blessed him, and he will be blessed. He realized that God was getting the wrong man out and the right man in, right at the very end. And if it was up to him, if it was up to Isaac, he would have blessed the wrong one. But God did what God does. And I'm saying all that to say this. God is in the business of doing the impossible. How in the world could this be fulfilled? Because it was promised that the older was going to serve the younger. It was promised that he was going to be the one to be blessed. How is that possible when the will of the Father was different? Well, because the will of the Heavenly Father has ultimate say. That he was getting the wrong man out and the right man in. And this account, we're going to see, this isn't actually, this event, this isn't where everything goes great then. As a matter of fact, this event, this stealing of the blessing by Jacob was really a disintegration of his family. Because after that, Isaac was so upset, he vowed to, whenever his father died, he was going to kill his brother. And so, again, Rebekah sent Jacob away, and for a long time, there was this, the family was blown apart by this. But later on, and this blessing does come to fruition much later, but it was dormant in the life of Jacob for some time. And later on in the book of, in chapter 32 of Genesis, we find that Jacob is still desiring blessing. So here's the point. Did that blessing work? Did it work for him? I think at the heart of it, he realized that it was a lie. I think the things that he longed to hear from his father, I think he probably loved hearing it, but deep down he knew it was all a lie. It was all deception. And so there's still in Jacob this longing to be blessed for who he is. And again, how does this look like for us today? Well, here, the way it looks like today is we do the same thing Jacob does. We dress up like somebody else. We pretend to be somebody else. That's how you get blessed by people. Oh, and you come to church, right? You come to church and you dress up and you pretend like you got it all together and you're a great Christian, right? And people will affirm you. But there is something far deeper than that. And the reality is there's something here that is still unmet in Jacob. And later on, we find this account where Jacob finds himself, this is very strange, by the way. He finds himself wrestling a man, and they're fighting all night. And then this man, it says that he just touched his leg or his thigh and dislocated his hip. And he refuses to let go. He refuses to let go. until what? He says, I won't let go until you bless me. And he comes to realize that the one he was wrestling was more than a man. Afterwards, he names that place, and he names it Peniel, for he says, I have seen God face to face, and my life is spared. But in this instance, when he is wrestling with him, let me just read a few verses here. In chapter 32 of Genesis, in verse 24. It says, and Jacob was left alone, and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of the day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint, and he wrestled with him. And he said, let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let you go, except you bless me. And he said unto him, what is your name? Now this is interesting. If this is God, if this is a pre-incarnate instance of God in the flesh here, why do you think he's asking what his name is? Don't you think he would know? He's asking him what his name is because his whole life he's trying to be somebody else. Who are you? What is your name? And he says, Jacob. And he said, thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. He had to get Jacob, and it took wrestling with him all night, to the place where he acknowledged who he actually was. What is your name? Who are you? And at that moment, when he came to terms with who he was, God's like, I'm going to change your name. I'm going to give you a new name. There is a legacy that God gives to us. And in Paul's letter to the Romans, he says that by the Spirit we cry, Abba, Father. There is a relationship that we are given by God through Jesus Christ of absolute acceptance, forgiveness, affirmation, and future because of him, because of Jesus, because of his goodness. This is something that is given to us through Jesus. And the way that he can do this is because if we remember early in Jesus' ministry when he is baptized, there's a voice that came from heaven and it said, this is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. It's a blessing. God is saying, this is who you are. And he was blessing him. This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. Because of Jesus doing that and taking our place, we are now called sons of God. We are brought into his family. Paul talks about this concept of adoption, where we are brought in, and now, regardless of what our earthly family looks like, we have a heavenly Father. And his attitude toward us is that of his attitude toward his only begotten Son. This is my beloved Son in whom I am well pleased. Do you know that God the Father delights in you? Do you know that? God the Father delights in you because of his grace. Now that is something that if that would settle into us, if we would understand even a fraction of what that means, would that affect the way that we live? Would that affect the things that we run after? Would that affect the persona that we try to put on so that people will applaud us and people will speak well of us? That stuff doesn't matter. It does matter if you don't have it. You'll run after it. But if you have it from the creator of the universe, then you don't desire it from anywhere else. And you have something to give. You have something to give away. You have something to pass on. You have something to put flesh to that God has done for you that you can do for your children and for others, for the next generation. That is what blessing is and what it looks like. And again, next week we're going to continue with this and look at and how much we need this, how much we desire this, and how we can actually get it. So let's go ahead this morning and we'll close in prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, God, I do thank you that we can call you Father and that you long to hear from us, that you accept us into your presence. You even tell us to come boldly into your presence, not because we're good servants, but because we are sons and daughters. We can come into your presence, and you long to see us. You long to be near us, and you have so much for us. You have a future for us. We thank you so much for that. And I ask that you would continue to let this sink down into the depths of who we are, that we might cry out in the Spirit, Abba, Father, and know you for who you are. And these things I pray in Christ's name, amen.
Would you stand and join us as we sing